Hello and welcome to All Saints Church. On this last Sunday of the liturgical year, we celebrate the feast of Christ the King, and we concentrate this morning on our reading from Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 to 46. Next Sunday marks the beginning of Advent, as the cycle of the church year begins once again. During Advent, we look forward to the birth of Jesus, but also to his anticipated return as King. We affirm that Christ has come, that he is present in the world today, and that he will come again in power. The feast day of Christ the King was inaugurated by Pope Pius XI in 1925. He saw it as a reminder to all believers that Christ must reign as King in our hearts, our minds, our wills and our bodies. But Pope Pius had another reason for instigating this new feast day. Europe of 1925 was in political turmoil, with on one hand the rise of communism and on the other the beginnings of rampant fascism. And Pope Pius's reaction to this evident rise in secularism was to establish the new feast day of Christ the King. In some ways this was a symbolic and subversive celebration. It was not only anti-fascist, but also called into the question the power and influence of all earthly rulers. Pope Pius's hope was that by establishing a feast day of such solemnity, people would understand that the Church has a right to freedom and immunity from the state. Matthew's writings in chapters 24 and 25 have sometimes been described as functioning like a window in the Gospel, or like a periscope that looks above the turbulence of Jesus' disputes and controversies, and above his forthcoming death, beyond all this to a future time when his kingship will be fully known. The teaching in these chapters focuses on the future, on Jesus' return, the end of time, and the final judgment. In our reading for today, Jesus describes a scene which would have been familiar to his listeners, one of a shepherd separating sheep and goats. Apparently, the two animals were often allowed to graze together during the day, tended by a single shepherd. Then, as night fell, the shepherd would need to separate them. But this is no gentle, pastoral scene. Although sometimes described as a parable, it's not really a parable. It's more of an apocalyptic vision of the Day of Judgment. It takes its roots from a vision described by the prophet Ezekiel. In the picture described by Jesus, the sheep will get their reward, but the goats will face eternal punishment. Although perhaps we shouldn't take these words too literally, this doesn't take away their powerful meaning. So how will we be judged? Of course we hope that we'll be sheep, but will we? Or will we be goats? I suspect that many of us can look back to actions in our own lives which we now regret. What have we done for which we need to seek God's forgiveness? When in the past have we behaved more like goats than sheep? And how often have we stood by and failed to act against the unjust treatment of others? Surely we must all share a part in the way God's creation has been mistreated, for our failure to protect the vulnerable in society, our failure to protect our environment for future generations. We only have to look at the recent rise of Black Lives Matter to acknowledge that what might have been acceptable in the past is no longer acceptable in today's world. So will we be sheep or will we be goats? In 21st century church circles, God's judgment is something we tend not to talk about. Judgment has a sense of such dreadful finality, with no room for repentance, reconciliation or forgiveness. It's something that seems somehow alien to our image of a creative, compassionate, forgiving and loving God. But why should we not expect God to judge us? After all, we make judgments ourselves. We are all too guilty of judging others. Too often we judge other people by how they look, or by the way they dress, or by the way they speak, by their name, or by the colour of their skin. And Jesus declares that when he returns as King, we too will be judged. And he will not judge us according to how often we've been to church, or said our prayers, or read the Bible, or by the depth of our theological knowledge. Of course, these are important. They're all part of our growing in faith, part of our journey of discipleship. But no, he will judge us by the way we have treated him, by the way we have responded to him. In our gospel passage, both the wicked and the righteous are surprised by this judgment, surprised by the verdict. Both groups ask the same question. Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison? Jesus' response is that the way we have treated him equates with the way we have treated the least of these who are members of my family. Judgment, Jesus says, is based on very practical acts of kindness, giving food and water, warmth and shelter to those in need, giving practical help to the sick and those in prison. Yes, Jesus calls us to recognise him as King and live as he wants us to live, to follow his example in the way we live our lives, and to see him in others, to live out our faith in practical ways by giving our time, our money, ourselves, to help those in need, the hungry, the homeless, the refugee, the stranger, the marginalised, those who are struggling at this time of unprecedented job loss, unprecedented grief, fear and despair. The post-communion prayer for today begins with the words, "Stir up, O Lord, the wills of your faithful people." These words have given rise to the traditional name for today of Stir Up Sunday. This was the day to make the Christmas puddings, or at least to prepare the mixture. Returning home from church, every member of the family would give the pudding mixture a stir and make a wish. Traditionally, the Christmas pudding was made with 13 ingredients, one each for Christ and his 12 disciples. It was also traditional to stir the pudding from east to west, in honour, apparently, of the 3 wise men. And this leads me almost seamlessly to a story, the story of the other wise man. First published in 1895, it tells the story of Artaban, a young magus who wants to follow the star to the birthplace of the coming king, carrying 3 precious jewels to give to the baby Messiah. He sets off to join the caravan of the 3 other wise men. He misses the caravan, but continues the search for his king, always one step behind. Artaban spends much of his remaining wealth and all of his energy helping the poor and needy people he meets on his journey. Until finally, as he nears the end of his life, he arrives in Jerusalem. Perhaps he can offer his one remaining precious jewel as a ransom for the life of Christ, who is about to be crucified. But no. Once again, Artaban finds himself using his wealth to help a stranger in distress. So once again, he fails to find the king he had spent so many years searching for. As Artaban reaches the end of his life, comes a realisation. He had, in fact, found the king. For he had seen Christ in every one of those poor and unfortunate people he had helped. So on this Christ the King Sunday, may God give us the grace to love our neighbour, to go the extra mile, to bring healing and comfort, to be generous, to forgive so that we also can be forgiven. and to trust God, so that we may reflect the power of Christ the King in our broken and frightened world.